Evaluators. Uh, just so you know, we recently had Alexis Carlier speak at the EA Global in Melbourne, the Effective Altruism Conference there on Animal Charity Evaluations. And we had a small panel with Alexis and Peter Singer discussing these issues as well. So those videos are up and ready for viewers to watch. So Jacy, I was just wondering, yeah, what is Animal Charity Evaluators? And what motivated you to get involved?
Yeah, so I've been involved with Animal Charity Evaluators for quite a while. It's an organization focused on finding and promoting the most effective ways to help animals. That primarily consists of our main project, which is compiling a list of recommendations. We have both top and standout charities. We actively fundraise for our top charities. We recommend donations to them on our website. And then we also have our standout charities, which includes some of the more maybe speculative and a wider variety of causes. We have 3 standout charities: Animal Equality, the Humane League, and Mercy for Animals. We have in-depth reviews on all of these organizations and more. It's sort of like GiveWell in that sense. We do very exhaustive research. Most of our audience doesn't want to do all of that research on their own, and that's the main value we provide to them. Last year, we raised $140,000 for these charities, the top ones. This year, we've raised over $500,000. So it's been really incredible seeing that growth. Yeah, and then more than that, we've been able to expand in other areas. So in addition to making those recommendations, we also promote them, on social media, and we're starting to do more of this. In 2016, we're hoping to host a conference on effective animal advocacy, bringing together people from psychology, from political theory, from all sorts of academic issues to come together and not just talk about animals, which has been done before, but to talk about animal advocacy, and in particular how we can do that most effectively. Yeah, so I got involved at ACE as a board member. Before that, I was actually even a volunteer, and then I was chair of the board until this year when they had a researcher leave, and they needed someone to fill the spot quickly, so I joined in. And yeah, and I don't know if you want to talk more broadly about how I got to ACE before that, or
yeah, why not? I think it's good. First of all, I just want to let note that the URL for Animal Charity Evaluators is animalcharityevaluators.org. I'll put that in the description, so if anyone wants to find you guys, it's quite easy. Now, yeah, why don't you give us some background about how you got involved? Where did your passion to join A.C.E stands for Animal Charity Evaluators. So when we say ACE, I guess, yeah, just for viewers, that's what we mean, Animal Charity Evaluators. So yeah, where did you get your passion from? What drove you into this cause?
Yeah, so I'm mostly interested in it through effective altruism, which I expect lots of your viewers are familiar with, but it's focused on doing the most good, not necessarily restricted to any cause area like animal advocacy, like global poverty, or affecting AI to ensure a better future for humanity and other sentient creatures. So I got involved in effective altruism actually from a pretty young age. I was very curious and wanted to take apart every problem in the world around me and think really hard and critically about it. And eventually this got to morality. I'm from very rural Texas where we have, 10 Commandments style morality. And it's just these, statements. You're supposed to follow them, and there's no real structure for what to do when these things conflict. Maybe the best you could get is talk to someone older than you, or consult your preacher or something. And this kind of frustrated me, and I wanted a more systematic way of understanding what I should do, and what constitutes a morally correct decision. And that led me to a lot of self-interrogation. I thought about the example: if you shouldn't steal, but you should also protect your family, what do you do when you need to steal to protect your family? And I dissected each of those rules to figure out why I cared about it. I took "thou shalt not steal" and said, okay, why do I care about stealing? Well, stealing, harms other people. Whenever you're taking other people's property, it tends to make them feel lost or upset. And that's generally a bad thing. If I'm stealing to protect my family because they need food, then, maybe I'm stealing food from another family and that's going to upset them. And I really cared about that. I cared about it because it was affecting their experiences, and their emotions, their happiness and their suffering. And it came to be that, every rule that I dissected in this way resulted in the same thing, that I was really caring about its ultimate effect, on the experience of sentient beings. And, I had no idea that this was a common thing. I actually sat on it for about 2 years and lived my life by what I called the greatest happiness principle, maximize net happiness. Had no idea anyone else had thought of this. And then finally, I was writing a paper for one of my classes on your life philosophy. So other people were saying things like, work hard, play hard. And I was just like, you can't live your life by work hard, play hard. That doesn't tell you what to do in every situation. And I was so excited that, I had this systematic rule for things. And I wrote this, convoluted essay about a tree and, saying that the base of the tree was the greatest happiness principle. And then I had branches, which were heuristics like not stealing or freedom or truth or justice. And then the leaves were, the actions that you would take that resulted from this long moral chain. And in the writing that paper, I happened to type into whatever search engine was being used at the time, greatest happiness principle. And I found out that this was a huge school of thought. There's tons of people, for hundreds of years thinking about this. And I found an online community called Philosophia, which, really became very exciting to me. Nobody else was thinking like I was around me. So I got pretty involved on there and was an active poster and things like that. And then from that and several other communities, it kind of evolved into effective altruism. And yeah, ever since, those early stages, it's really just been a, comprehensive, systematic view of doing good. I was never satisfied with just, feeling warm fuzzies or just doing some good. It really excited me to do the most good. And actually, just a couple years ago, I made the transition. I was originally focused on global poverty. I actually wanted to be an investment banker and donate lots of money to, give well-recommended charities, which is another charity evaluator that focuses on the developing world. And then also be an investment banker in those countries in order to contribute to their economy. And, I realized that my thinking about non-human animals was wrong in many ways. I think I was definitely a victim of what we call speciesism, the idea that there's some sort of like human superiority intrinsic, not because of, increased sentience or any of the things that might make sense in some realm, but just because, our virtue of being human, which I think upon reflection, basically nobody actually believes that. So an appreciation for those things led me to focus on animals and led me to Animal Charity Evaluators. And then I was planning on earning to give still. But whenever the research position opened up, I took that, and that's where I am now.
Fantastic. What a life story. That's amazing. It's a great journey there. So it seems as though you're a broadly consequentialist now in your thinking about how to evaluate how to do the most good in the world. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely consequentialist, but I think more so than a lot of my peers, I take on, two-level, what could be called two-level utilitarianism, and this idea of, we can't go about our lives making utilitarian calculations for every little decision. We need to use rules of thumb. And I think I do this more so than a lot of other people who would call themselves consequentialists. But ultimately, in the deep theoretical thought experiments, what I care about is utilitarianism and maximizing, net happiness, where happiness includes all positive emotions, and the absence of negative emotions.
Yeah, so day to day, you're not really making like a fully utilitarian calculated decisions. You're just going by a set of sort of pseudo deontological rules of thumb in order to guide your path, and maybe throw in a bit of virtue ethics from day to day. And then coming to big decisions, you might actually sit down and calculate what the best thing to do is, right? I'm
Exactly.
similar that way. So yeah, look, that's interesting. So can you discuss what A.C.E does seem to take a broadly consequentialist view on how to evaluate animal charities. Do you want to discuss what A.C.E does there in reference to this philosophical position which you also hold?
Of course. So, we make a lot of moral decisions. Most commonly, we make decisions between different charities and which one does the most good. And, most of our day-to-day work doesn't involve deep meta-ethical questions. It involves just saying, well, this charity was really successful with this campaign, so we expect them to be successful with their next campaign. But we do have to make a lot of subjective judgment calls. And we try to outline these, in places on our website. Like we have a strategic plan which outlines, our goals of doing the most good and what we see as good. I would say that ultimately we do take a consequentialist approach in the sense that we are trying to maximize good done. But I would say that maybe even, I don't know if I'd say more so, I'd say that in the case of animal advocacy, especially in evaluations between charities, it actually doesn't matter too much which sort of meta-ethical approach you take. I mean, obviously, if you're taking a very hardcore, rule-based approach and your rules are something like, we should just help others, or we should use this charity because it's most honest to our values. If you deeply believe in the abolition of animal agriculture, you might have a moral that's saying, okay, I only want to support a charity that is explicitly stating that abolition is the ultimate goal. And even if another charity is doing more good for animals, you might not go with that. But we don't go that far. But we do, for example, we have a list of criteria. And one of those criteria is a cost effectiveness estimate. And in some sense, that really is our only criteria. And if we could capture everything in that cost effectiveness estimate, we would love to just make a giant spreadsheet and have an output that says, all right, well, this should be your top charity. And it would make our jobs much easier. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So we end up using lots of rules of thumb. For example, we like charities that are transparent. We like charities that have a strong track record. Even though we do want to maximize expected value, we sort of discount risky charities to some sort of baseline. So having a strong track record behind you helps, because we think the average charity is doing great things, but isn't really competitive with the best charities. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly does. I mean, but I guess there's a bias towards charities which record and have proper paperwork, proper finances, and who have a track record, but also who are working on things that have very measurable near-term outcomes. It makes it's difficult. How would you evaluate something like the abolitionist project, for instance? I mean, they may be making philosophical headway, but it's very hard to track actually what how that philosophy has made any real world changes, however valuable it may be.
Yeah, it's challenging, and we've definitely grown in it. So I think similar to GiveWell and their transition from their traditional work to GiveWell Labs and now the Open Philanthropy Project, I'd say we're broadening our scope as we go along and getting better at evaluating those sorts of things. So this year we actually evaluated a much broader swath of charities than we had before. We evaluated the Non-Human Rights Project. We evaluated New Harvest, both of which got recommendations as standout charities. And for example, one of the approaches that we took there is we actually didn't do cost effectiveness estimates for either. I should say we created them on our end, and then saw how, because we wanted to just try it out, saw how speculative and flimsy they were, and decided that we shouldn't even give them weight in our own decision making. And then also ultimately, they weren't, the best thing to put out in the public for our readers, largely because people will see them. And, for example, if we evaluate a charity on its long-term outcomes and it turns out way better than our top charities, people will say, oh, well, this charity is sparing 500 animals per dollar. Your top charity is only spare 10. Clearly, you're making the wrong decision. And it's hard to capture that nuance that we want to give with those quantitative estimates. But yeah, that's an example of a step that we've taken to do those charities. We try to, for example, look at historical approaches. So the Non-Human Rights Project, is trying to make legal change in the fundamental rights of animals. They're an amazing project being led by Steve Wise, and they've done great work for chimpanzees right now. And if you evaluate them on what they've done to this day, they actually haven't made any physical changes for those chimpanzees. They've only made, legal kind of theoretical, maybe establishing some precedent in the courts. So instead of evaluating them on their own track record, except insofar as we can say, well, you wanted to make this legal change, you did, we evaluate them maybe based on the historical evidence. So, in the anti-slavery movement, the anti-human slavery movement, for example, there was great success through the case of, Somerset in the UK, was a big case that, both inspired a lot of activism and then also led to, further legal changes that led to the abolition of slavery in the UK and then in its colonies eventually. Yeah, so it's tough, and I know that's not a great answer, but we try some approaches like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get down some basics. I mean, there's a few questions here which you've sort of partially answered, but I guess, do you believe animal advocacy is an effective cause area? And if you do, of course you do. What's the, in a nutshell, why do you believe that?
Yeah, so Alexi and I both gave presentations at EA Global. He gave one at Melbourne, and I gave one at Mountain View. And we were going by the standard sort of framework for evaluating cause area within effective altruism, namely evaluating it based on its scale. So how large is the issue? In the case of animal suffering, it's huge. There's over 60 billion land animals slaughtered each year for food, most of which are raised in absolutely atrocious conditions. Very few live on kind of the picturesque McDonald's farm that we all like to picture. And then if you consider wild animals, that number grows hugely. Especially if you start considering fish, and especially if you start considering what might be called, quote, lower, that's not a great term to use, but perhaps less mentally sophisticated life forms like insects. So definitely a huge issue. And then in the same way, human sentience is expected to, even though there's a chance we might go extinct, there's also a chance that we expand to the stars. There's also a good case to be made that non-human sentience, even if that looks very different from what animals look like today, could expand in a similar way. And then the second criteria would be neglectedness. So if there's a really important issue such as climate change in some regards, then you might say, well, lots of people are working on climate change, so my marginal impact probably isn't going to be that big. Instead, you might say, well, one area of climate change, geoengineering, for example, which is actually trying to, once the globe warms, take some sort of what you might call a drastic measure, like injecting particles into the atmosphere to block out sunlight, taking something kind of crazy like that. And obviously, since that's not something most people want to think about, it's not really an attractive thing in the same way that encouraging recycling might be, from both a political and a psychological sense. It might be more neglected, and you might want to focus on that. So in the same way, we see that animal advocacy, by measure of charitable donations, is somewhere around like 3% or so of total giving. That's 3%, and it's including environmental causes as well. So it's receiving a very small amount, especially relative to that size. And then if you look within that, you also see that way more of that is going to shelters for companion animals, for example, which are doing great things, and I think are cost effective, in the scheme of things. I haven't crunched the numbers on that, but I think they do a lot of good, compared to many human projects. But whenever you focus on farmed animals in particular, they're receiving a tiny fraction of that, and given their size, it seems like that's really they deserve a lot more. And then finally, the last criteria, which I think is actually the one that animal advocacy struggles most on, is tractability. So, if we have some sort of large amount of resources to spend, how much project progress can we be expected to make, maybe relative to the size of the issue? I think the difficulty here is that there's not the same sort of evidence for activism, for advocacy, for social change as there is for something like a medical intervention, like distributing anti-malarial nets to the global poor. So, we're working on pretty limited stuff, some of it's case studies, some of it's, marketing, for-profit industry evidence, some of it's just previous track records. But I think in many cases we have shown tractability in a pretty promising way. So for example, corporate reform, is convincing executives of companies to change their policies in order to reduce suffering of farmed animals. So for example, you might convince McDonald's to have their eggs be from chickens who aren't raised in battery cages, which are very tiny. Chickens aren't even able to spread their wings. I have two chickens who live with me actually, and they were both raised in those battery cages. And observing their behavior, just them having, they actually, in their room, they have a half of our living room, but then they have a very smaller, it's actually a dog kennel. And that's not too big, but they're very happy with that space, and they actually stay there most of the day. And that's just a tremendous welfare difference. And this has happened. In the past about 15 years of animal advocacy, we've seen a lot of humane reforms passed. These animals are still living in atrocious conditions, and it's by no means a life worth living, but it has been meaningful strides. So I think there's some evidence of tractability, but I think that's the most challenging one for animal advocacy. Overall, compared to other cause areas, I think it's definitely a contender for the most effective. And, obviously I'm maybe biased here, or at least you can predict my answer based on what I do. I think it's probably the most promising area for a lot of people.
Excellent. So, like, we should be noted that they had specific examples of tractability. McDonald's has been convinced to have more humane farming, especially more recently the eggs, like yeah, I think are all free range now in America. Now, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that this is in process in Australia, getting implemented, but has not yet been implemented. Is
Yeah,
that
so
correct?
not quite free range, but to cage free, that
Okay.
has been implemented. If I'm not 100% confident in that, but I think Animals Australia did some campaigning and got it passed, but it's definitely passed in the U.S. Yeah, McDonald's was actually one of the original targets. So there was a McCruelty campaign, which is probably one of the most famous of the humane reform campaigns because it was one of the first. But McCruelty was, pointing to McDonald's in particular, because McDonald's is so big and, a lot of people don't like the chain for other reasons, because it's seen as like fast food and unhealthy and things. So yeah, but I mean, they've been, I'm hesitant to call, any animal agriculture company, pioneers, but they have been, leading those changes in many ways.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. So what are some, so I guess we've kind of answered the question as what sorts of animal advocacy areas like you can focus on in these sort of categories or things that you research as part of ACE or, yeah. But what sort of top charities can people look to? What sort of top charities does ACE deal with regards to animal advocacy? And what would you recommend to friends? Which particular charities at the moment would you say are the most effective?
Yeah, of course. So we recently did our December donations, myself and my girlfriend, who has the two chickens, and we gave to Animal Equality, which is one of the top charities recommended by Animal Charity Evaluators, just to give people a sense of what they do on a day-to-day basis. Lots of it is public campaigning, so stuff like broadcasting investigations. They've had a lot of media coverage based on them going into farms and exposing the cruelty there. Because actually, many people today recognize that these animals aren't treated very poorly. But 20 years ago, that wasn't really the case. People weren't really aware. And these undercover investigations, where in the U.S. you would go in as a employee, you'd actually get hired at the facility and then wear hidden cameras. In Europe and other places, the laws are less stringent, so they're actually often able to just walk in. Sometimes they'll be deceptive in this and claim they're maybe a college student. Doing a project on animal farming and want to document the facilities, for example. Sometimes groups will go in at night, often place hidden cameras that then document conditions during the day, so they have better lighting and see the workers and whatnot. And these sorts of ways of bringing it to the public's attention. And Animal Equality, they don't do the shady stuff, but they do undercover investigations that end up bringing it to a public light. And then they broadcast those on social media and stuff like that. Other projects of our top charities include Humane Reform. So the Humane League is a great example of this. They've actually been having some really huge successes over the past year. If you've heard of the big changes in battery cages, that's been for a large part them. I mean, it's multiple organizations that work on this front. So like the Humane Society is a organization that more works one-on-one with the companies. So you'll have the Humane League who does the like social media campaigns and the getting people to protest, and then you'll have the Humane Society is working with the companies in the, I don't want to call them the back rooms, but in the offices, saying, well, here's how you would actually implement this policy, or like here's how it would affect your brand and your bottom line. And this combination of efforts does a lot of good. And then probably the other area that's pretty common is leafleting and online ads, which are individual interventions with the goal of changing diets mostly. They have other effects like creating more activists, creating more donations, creating more people who will vote for new laws that help animals. But largely it's to get people on an individual level to go, vegetarian or to reduce their consumption, which then leads to obviously a reduction in the number of animals suffering in the really bad conditions. Those are the main projects, yeah. And then the organization that I didn't mention that's our top charity is Mercy for Animals. They do lots of investigations. They're the main group doing them in the U.S. and also a wonderful group, yeah. And then I guess our standout charities are worth a mention as well, including the Non-Human Rights Project and New Harvest, both of whom I think if you're taking a long-term perspective. Oh, and then I would also definitely include Animal Ethics. Animal Ethics is even one of the few groups campaigning for wild animal suffering. So depending on how, that's sort of a different issue than farmed animals, but depending on how you think about its tractability, it's certainly, more neglected and maybe even larger in scale. So it's really important, and Animal Ethics is another great organization.
Fantastic. Well, let's go on to a little bit of a meta question. That is, what do you find the most distressing about animal suffering? What is it? Is it the actual feeling of disgust you get when you see a video of animals being treated unfairly, or is it something more philosophical or ideological, or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, so it's interesting actually, and I think this has surprised some people whenever I've told them. But whenever I went vegetarian, I actually just read text on like the conditions that animals were kept in. Like the only one I really remember was that a chicken, or I don't know the exact figure, but some number of chickens is kept on the space of a record, like a music record, and that just seemed like really really bad to me. And it seemed like a really serious form of suffering. So it wasn't videos, it wasn't pictures, it wasn't anything that was like provoking grotesqueness, or grossing me out or making me like cry or anything like that. And lots of other people have those sorts of experiences. But for me, it was just that simply. And I think that largely comes from, well, I would say that me going vegetarian maybe didn't have as much to do with this, but me focusing on animal advocacy as an EA cause came mostly from me recognizing the individuality and what I call the personhood, the moral personhood, the subjectivity of non-human animals. So I was auditing a philosophy graduate seminar in undergraduate on animal sentience, and it was all kind of esoteric discussions about theories of mind and things like that. But it gave me an appreciation for the individuality, and I think this sort of ties into speciesism, which I think affects a lot of effective altruists and people with that mindset, because you have the rational argumentation back and forth, and you're expecting to hear some key rational argument that will change your mind on everything. But oftentimes it's really deeper than that, and it's kind of a bias that you haven't realized. And I think I was a victim of that. And I think really the thing that moved me was acknowledging that bias and getting rid of it. I'm sure I haven't fully, but that bias towards what people would call human supremacy and the idea that we are somehow better. So I was of the view like, well, your arguments make sense for animal advocacy and it does seem really important, but I just couldn't see myself giving to non-human animals. I just think they're not as important as humans. And I wasn't really basing that in the sorts of evidence that I would normally demand of my own decision making, which I think was a mistake. And recognizing that personhood definitely changes the way you deal with facts like a hen not being able to spread her wings in a cage. The normal reaction to that is like, oh wow, like that sucks. But instead my reaction is like, oh wow, like if I were that chicken inside of that cage and I couldn't spread my wings, I would just be like absolutely freaked out. I would, as a human, maybe have some better sense of my surroundings, but as a non-human animal, especially as someone who doesn't have the understanding of the world that I do, that would just be such an intensely fearful and like frustrating experience to be confined, or be a mother pig who's confined in a gestation crate where she can't even turn around. Like that just sounds so horrific once you kind of put yourself in their place. And I think that's really what motivates me the most, or at least makes kind of the crucial change between not caring and caring. Yeah, and I think this is noticeable whenever I even just see like on social media a video of animal cruelty, and I'll notice myself at first whenever I see it, I see the animal as like an other. So like I recently saw a video of a dog who was in a very unfortunate situation and he was covered with fleas, and I noticed that for the first moment I saw that as like, oh wow, that sucks. And then a split second later I saw myself as oh, that's an individual, and he is suffering in the same way I suffer, or at least in the same category of things. And it's visceral whenever you notice it. It kind of jolts your system. But yeah, acknowledging that personhood, I think, has been a big deal to me.
Fantastic. Yeah. So is it suffering that's involved in animals who are alive, who and or who lack a sense of being able to stand up for themselves,
Mhm.
that grates upon you? I mean, like you were talking about rights before. For instance, the anti-slavery, the abolitionist movement in the past. Often, historically, it was the case that whites had to actually stick up for them, but they still did have like an inability to stick up for themselves a little bit. And then, the women's rights have been able to stick up for themselves to a fair degree compared to like what an animal would. It seems as though the animals are in no position really to put forth an argument as to why they shouldn't be treated cruelly. And other than, just acting scared and sort of shying away, flinching away from pain and just, I guess, characteristics of like an agent who's not enjoying an experience. So yeah, I mean, like I think it's important that like we have people who can present arguments to put arguments on for them on their behalf. But I guess, people will then on the other side of the coin argue that we're just imposing anthropocentric arguments upon them, saying, well, our notion of pain and suffering might be widely different from them, and our notion of justice and welfare could be widely different from what they experience, if they have any sort of concept of that at all. And therefore, should we be enacting our values upon these animals to reduce suffering, especially in the wild? People have brought up this particular contention about reducing wild animal suffering.
Yeah. So there are several things there, and I'll go through them in turn. So I think the first thing about what compels me in terms of is it the suffering while the animals are alive, or the lack of positive experience? I think both are pretty compelling. I find myself on a day-to-day basis, whenever I think about farmed animals, not really thinking as much about the loss of potential flourishing. I'm not a negative utilitarian, and I definitely wouldn't accept, I would accept a pinprick for a utopia in that sense. But I do think there's an urgency argument to suffering that's really important. And, I think of that from my own example. If somebody can give me an happy experience, like I go to farmed animal sanctuaries a lot. And if somebody can give me the experience of, running free on a field of grass like sanctuary animals do, I'm very grateful for that. And I think that's really exciting. But it feels like that the person who is giving me that is doing something very nice. But if they're not doing that, it doesn't feel like they're doing a moral wrong in the same sense that somebody who's not alleviating me from deep suffering is doing a moral wrong. So it sort of ties into the latter point about the final point about wild animals. And I think it's the case that deep suffering, the sort that goes on for both farmed animals and wild animals, of being eaten alive in the wild or being starving, and farmed animals are starved as well on transport and in other situations. That there's something very deep about that should cause us to act in the absence of strong counter arguments against acting. So I think there's a default there, definitely. And I think that whenever people argue that we shouldn't be imposing our morality on wild animals like that, I think they're sort of missing that urgency and that perspective. I don't think they're putting themselves in the role of the wild animal. If you're there's an Onion article that was about a lion who had been killed by a poacher, and the article was just saying the lion doesn't feel like he's a part of the great circle of life. And I think this is so true. And like many things, the Onion is the authority on this subject. But it was a really good point, because if you're deeply suffering in that sort of situation, you're not, there's no way that you're going to think about, even if you have a human sense of morality, that you're going to think, well, this is serving a greater purpose, oh, this is just natural. You're going to think like, I wish somebody would help me right now, or I wish I could help myself. I wish I could get out of this situation. So I think that overweighs the arguments against morally imposing. I think the argument against morally imposing can be salvaged on an empirical standpoint by saying something like, oh, well, whenever we've imposed morally in like human to human situations, oftentimes the recipients have not been appreciative of that. But I think that's a different situation, because, those have been, in a sense, much more complicated situations where those humans were, had their own values and had their own thoughts on whether these things that didn't involve deep suffering were right or wrong. So this is like, I have a friend who is from the Middle East, and whenever I talk to him about cultural appropriation, and in America we get mad about people like dressing up as racially tied figures, and it's that fact is completely unrelated, but he doesn't see that as an issue at all. If people are doing that of his culture, he thinks that's totally okay, and he has like no sense of cultural appropriation. And I think we should be sensitive of going over there and trying to impose our sense of that higher level. Cultural appropriation is a very complicated moral concept. And if, even though it's wrong in many situations, whenever you're making people feel really bad because they feel like you're mocking their culture or something, it doesn't feel that way to people in other situations. However, with the case of humans and wild animals, I think the wild animals, that suffering that they experience is not this complicated moral concept where, they could just not feel like they're being mocked. Instead, it's just that they are suffering deeply, and we can alleviate that suffering. And it's much more straightforward. And it's much easier for us to make the gap of, okay, well, they would obviously prefer to not be suffering right now. Whereas making the gap of, oh, they would prefer to not be culturally appropriated in the sense that we care about, is much more difficult to make. And then just to tie on the middle point that you raised that I kind of skipped over, I think that the fact that animals can't speak up for themselves in the same way that most humans can is an unfortunate situation. I don't think it's damning in the sense that I don't think animal rights will succeed. Many people will say that. They'll say, why are you campaigning for animal rights? There's no hope. We'll never extend beyond the people who can speak for themselves. I think that there is hope from several streams. One is just existing stuff we've done for animals. So people have been very successful in, for example, companion animals, in bringing their stories to the forefront. And it's easier there because these companion animals like cats and dogs are living in people's homes. So it's very easy for you to have an example that you can relate to. But I think we can do the same thing for farmed animals, for example, like through sanctuaries and through bringing their stories to the forefront. And I think that's very important for people to get that recognition of personhood and overcome that bias of speciesism. And I think there is hope. And, I would say that in human movements like the anti-slavery movement, that was largely allies speaking who could speak. You had a few freed slaves. So, for example, one in the UK, went on a book tour and had his autobiography. And, it was a big deal. And he was certainly a great spokesperson. But, there's no denying that some allies were able to make a lot of progress there. There are other movements like this, like the children's rights movement. Children, although they can speak English, they're politically powerless in the sense that, they can't vote, for example. They can't organize very well. It's hard to get, 110-year-olds to go on a protest and, leave their parents' house or something like that. They get in trouble and, it probably wouldn't go very well. But we've seen hope through those movements. So I'm optimistic about it being an ally-based movement. Yeah. We kind of skipped around on several topics there, so feel free to, if anything didn't make sense, feel free to tie back.
Yeah. Right. So I had a question. I kind of forgot it. Right. Okay. Let's just, like, for the time being, let's talk about whether, yes. Okay. Actually, I remember what the question was now. So backtrack. So yeah, I've had the experience where people seem absolutely disgusted, and think it's at the idea of intervening in complex systems, so largely complex system of the ecosystem, and they're worried about the knock-on effects of intervening and reducing suffering there. And so, for instance, I just recently had somebody like talk about like stepping down as an admin as one of the groups because the topic was being brought up, unless the post was removed. So it seems though there's quite a lot of people out there who have concern about like intervening, any form of intervention in the ecosystem, in affecting reducing suffering there. I think what they're more concerned about is not small efforts, but some of the grandiose, large-scale efforts that may be described in as being possible in the far future. But have you got any sort of thoughts about that? Have you experienced this this sort of effect in your life? There's people actually sort of gotten angry at you for bringing up this issue before.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because I'm very much from like progressive kind of liberal circles. Even though I was raised in rural Texas, I pretty quickly left that and moved to some very liberal areas, and was very used to people with very strong environmentalist values, for example. And the thing is, whenever you're involved in those things, sorry.
Yeah, deep green ecology, I think it's called, deep green environment.
Yeah, like deep ecology, for example. And the challenge is that many people are used to intervening in the environment, meaning like, oh, we're going to abuse wild animals for profit, or natural resources, and cause mass destruction of these things that they consider beautiful, like forests or mountains and things like that. And this is seen all throughout popular media and stuff. So I think it's very understandable that environmentalists and other people, the general public as a whole, has an aversion to anyone saying, I'm going to step in. And then beyond that, we also have all these, tropes throughout society of, non-intervention in the wild. Don't mess with Mother Nature is the thing that I've heard a lot. And it's hard to overcome those because we have to separate ourselves from the people who are trying to do it for selfish or malicious intent, and establish ourselves as people, as wild animal advocates who are wanting to do this for the wild animals themselves, not because it makes us feel better, or because we personally like are very opposed to the suffering, but the wild animals are fine with it. Instead, it's because we are accounting for their own interests. And that's a tough step to make, because in a way we are in the same ballpark as those people with not so nice intentions. And it's challenging. And I talked about this in my Vox article, was kind of the main objections that we encounter as wild animal advocates. And some of them are more empirical in nature, and saying like, well, we have a bad track record, so obviously anything we try won't go well. In which case we have to make it clear, well, we're not saying that we should just dive in, and we're doing a lot more research and things like we've intervened in other complex systems. And this relates to the point we were talking about earlier with the urgency of suffering. And, we shouldn't kick an issue off the table because of these, initial concerns that we have, because it's such an important issue. The wild animals, if they don't deserve to, be alleviated of their suffering, they at least deserve for us to think very hard and do a lot of research and very carefully consider this. And I think it's unfortunate that some people aren't willing to give it that careful consideration even. So yeah, and it's a complex idea. People generally want soundbite ideas. They want you to give your argument in 4 words. And I'm not sure wild animal suffering, the argument for intervention, or at least considering intervention, can be summed up that easily. So yeah, I mean, that's not a great answer in the sense that it's not an ultimate solution to that resistance we'll get. But it's such an important issue, and there are so many wild animals out there who are desperate to be alleviated from their suffering, that we need to push through, I think, resistance. With all the careful consideration that we can, things like developing ideas in circles that are going to be more friendly to it. Like effective altruism has been an example of people who are willing to listen to, seemingly radical ideas in order to do a lot of good. And maybe, embedding ourselves in those circles and building up strength and momentum in a community. And I think we've done that a lot. And then, progressing out into the, the wild, so to speak, out into the, public discourse. I think the Vox article that I wrote was a good effort, in the sense that it introduced it to the public discourse. I mean, obviously from the resistance that was seen to that, and people sort of responding to a few lines in the article where they clearly hadn't read the other lines right after it, where I addressed their counter arguments and stuff. Obviously that's might have meant I went a little too far in that. I think on that it was still a good thing. But I'm not keen on writing another wild animal article for a little while at least.
Right. Yes.
It's also because I've spent my personal weirdness points on that. But I think we're doing great things, and I think people like Brian Tomasic and David Pierce are making huge strides in making it such that eventually it can become a if not a mainstream issue, at least an issue that people in the circles who can make important decisions about it, like policymakers and stuff, are seriously considering it.
And it is something that Peter Singer's brought up in some of his articles recently as well, which I think is, he's got a wide listening, and it's great that he can actually bring these ideas to the public square for them to be discussed. So let's talk about the problem of animal suffering actually being solved. And we just brought up Peter Singer. What are your thoughts on Peter Singer's idea of the expanding circle of ethical consideration, and and also Steven Pinker's extension to this idea in his Better Angels of Our Nature, as it applies to all sentient life forms, not only humans? But so what are your thoughts on the progress of actually reducing suffering? Are you in favor of standing by the fact that we have, and how far do we have to go?
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots of streams of evidence we can use here, including what's been done so far in animal advocacy, which I think is one of the most important ones. We have seen a lot of progress. We've seen a lot of progress in the animals that are sort of least costly for us to advocate for and to accept in our moral circles, like companion animals. It's costly in a sense to include farmed animals in your moral circle because it puts a pressure on you to stop eating them, for example. It's hard to be morally consistent if you're eating someone and participating in the cruelty, and then also advocating against it. So I think it's understandable that there'll be a lot of challenge in some of the areas that are the largest right now and that we maybe haven't seen as much progress in. I've read about half of Pinker's book. I actually just listened to it on a flight a couple weeks ago, and I think that his arguments apply well to human on human violence that comes with a obvious and sinister nature. So for example, like medieval torture, things like the Iron Maiden and stuff like that, that's all I think pretty well went away because of moral progress. I think it's less clear how much that will expand. So in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we saw this expansion where everyone who is human, although that took a while to come to fruition with things like people of all genders and people of all ethnicities, deserve serious moral consideration. But I think it's sort of categorical in the sense that it's like one step to expand to all humans, and then another step to expand to all sentient beings. And I think it's might be a little bit overconfident to say, well, within the human category, we've seen it expand all the way across it. But the thing is, until we start actually moving to the next category very strongly, for example, if Non-Human Rights Project is successful in establishing legal personhood for chimpanzees, I'll see this as a major sign that we've sort of broken what people will call, the glass ceiling or a glass wall of some sort. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about Non-Human Rights Project, is because I think once you go that little bit, then making the sort of quantitative, not as categorical advances is easier. I'm optimistic. I'm deeply uncertain though. And I think one of the arguments against focusing on animal advocacy, and indeed on animal advocacy in general, at least when it comes to moral progress, is that you might expect, okay, well, humans are well-intentioned and violence has declined, so we should expect all these social problems to resolve in the future. I think I don't think people should be doing that, because I think there's still too much risk. We just haven't seen the expansion into non-human animals. We haven't seen as much expansion whenever it comes to directly conflicting with our interests. We also haven't seen as much expansion whenever it seems to involve ignorance rather than like maliciousness. So we abuse farmed animals right now largely just because it's convenient. We've eaten animals for all of human existence, and it's easy to continue with that. And it's against the status quo to make some sort of change to plant-based or cellular agriculture. And it seems pretty hard to make that sort of progress when it doesn't involve saying, oh no, these people eating animals, they're actually like sadistic, they're wanting to cause suffering. Instead, they're just not caring about it as much. They're just maybe ignorant. And this is the struggle of ally-based movements. Is one of the things that you might do in the 1960s civil rights movement is make it really inconvenient for people to support segregation. It makes you socially sometimes even ostracized to do so in that sort of situation. And it might come to the case where in animal advocacy, we have to create those sorts of pressures, create stigmas around supporting animal agriculture and things like that. So anyway, that's a complicated way of saying I'm very uncertain, and I think it's important that we work on it.
Okay, cool. So what do we really then need to do to keep this expanding circle of ethical consideration going, and to keep it expanding in a sense, instead of just stop arbitrarily, to break even more glass ceilings?
Yeah. So I am also very uncertain on this question, although it's what I spend most of my time thinking about.
Yeah. You don't have to give me the correct answer. I just want to hear what you think. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. So I think that advocacy that places personhood on the forefront seems really good. It seems to have been true in many other social movements. So for anti-slavery, for example, one of the big deals was, am I not a man and a brother? No, am I? Yeah, I think that was it. And it was a medallion or a pendant that a lot of the upper class wore whenever it was like abolition was becoming a hot issue. And it was placing, it had a picture of a human slave with his arms like this shackled, sort of in a praying position. And given how important religion was at the time, that was really placing those human individuals that people had objectified and dehumanized, for lack of a better term, into the frame as someone who is like you. They're a man, they're a brother, they're a religious person, maybe, if they're in a praying position like that. So I think undercover investigations can do this. I think sanctuaries can do this. I'm not sure how much adding more individual animals to sanctuaries does, but I think the existence of sanctuaries and the existence of stories, so things like talking about companion animals that people have who are rescued farmed animals, like pigs are a great example of this because they have so many behavioral similarities to dogs. There was a news story not too long ago about a pig being the best dog in the dog training class, and she was doing so well at sitting and shaking hands and all of these dog behaviors. So I think things that efficiently place personhood at the forefront. In investigations, for example, there are some that outline the lifetime of a farmed animal, of course, because they can't actually follow an individual throughout this. They instead just use footage of different animals, but they outline the life of that animal from her beginning. So if she was a pig, or if he was a pig, he'd be castrated, for example, and then grow up, if she was a girl, in a gestation crate and giving birth, and then eventually go to slaughter. And when people see that entire cycle, they gain an appreciation for that animal as an individual. And I think that's really valuable. And then I think, in terms of how do we do that, it comes to what does it most efficiently. I think undercover investigations are very good at getting lots of press coverage, so I'm excited about them. Also protests and things like that seem to be doing a pretty decent job of it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So, okay, so talking about like a ACE, you can donate like $150 per year. It's been brought up. Is there some kind of moral equivalency in donating money to ACE approved charities in offsetting one's own meat consumption? Is that like would you say that's equivalent to going vegetarian or vegan? Is there some kind of equivalence, like sort of similar to carbon offsetting?
Yeah, so this is one of those questions where I'll give a theoretical answer and then a practical answer. And like in theory, yes, my consequentialist self does accept that there's some amount of money. I don't have strong views on what that amount of money is. That does as much good as going vegetarian or vegan. But I think that as a social norm, it's not a great one. I don't think that we should start passing out leaflets that say donate X amount of money every month, help someone else go vegetarian. I mean, some of the weaker arguments against it might be things just like slippery slope, saying, well, if everyone were doing that, then nobody would be going vegetarian or vegan. Everyone would just be donating to each other in some sense. But I think the stronger arguments are in terms of how compelling it is. Whenever you stop eating animals, that's a clear sign that you think about basically every day, at least at the beginning. I've been vegan for quite a while now, and I don't give it any thought except whenever it comes up in conversation or things like that. But at the beginning, you're thinking about it every day. You're thinking, oh, I'm making a conscious choice to leave this animal off my plate. and to instead go with this other option. And I think that really ties you to the cause. It builds your social identity as someone who cares about animals in a way that donating doesn't. I also think that it sparks conversations in a way donating doesn't. So unless you're going to be under some sort of obligation that every time you sit down with someone for dinner, you tell them, oh, by the way, I'm donating X amount to animal charities, then, you're not starting as many conversations as you are by going vegetarian or vegan. And, there's a counter argument to this that's, well, if you're convincing someone else to go vegetarian or vegan, then they're going to be having those conversations and stuff. But I think whenever it comes to thinking about social norms, especially given that, as people in our social circles who I think are relatively influential compared to the average person, especially if they're, in effective altruism and talking to a lot of other activists or donors and stuff like that, I think you can make a stronger case than the average, recipient of a leaflet who goes vegetarian will, and things like that. And yeah, whenever we're talking about it, like as organizations or in our public media materials, I think these social norm considerations come into play a lot more. If you're an individual who's not going to talk about it at all, and you're a hermit who lives out in the woods, then it might, the direct consequentialist, myopic considerations might come into play more.
Absolutely. And I thought, what do you think about the idea of not eating any meat that has a face? Like, for instance, like oysters or mussels or scallops or things like that, or a sea cucumber. These are arguably meat. However, people have argued that they don't have a complex enough system in order to, or a locomotion system in order to be worried about being eaten. It's sort of like like meat without brains, in a sense, meat without sort of consciousness or the ability to suffer. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it differs based on who your average audience is. So someone in our circles who hasn't really been exposed to many animal rights arguments, or the ones that they have been, very deontological, PETA kind of arguments that they haven't listened to very much, then starting the conversation of, oh, I don't eat anyone who's sentient, I don't eat anyone with a face, is a similar idea, might actually be really compelling. They'll be like, oh, wow, like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like that makes way more sense than these, crazy vegans that I've known about. And in that case, I can see it being maybe even a stronger signal than veganism itself. If you're in a situation where you're having to communicate with people who might not appreciate that nuance, and they might instead see bivalve veganism, not eating animals except for oysters or mussels or other bivalves, then, the average person might see that as inconsistent. They might say like, oh, well, I thought you were a vegan, but really you're only a vegan in these situations. Well, I'm going to be a vegan, every day except Sunday, no, that wasn't a good argument, but I'm going to be a vegan except whenever it comes to, chicken, eggs, beef, cows, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of direct impact, I buy the arguments that oysters and other bivalves are marginally sentient. Some of my friends know a lot more about this than I do. I don't even like oysters and mussels, so it's not really a concern to me. I wouldn't be eating them, even if I weren't vegan. But dredging might occur in the cases of some of them. I think oysters and mussels are the ones that are basically no dredging. Sorry, dredging is like bringing a large net through the ocean and killing a lot of other animals in the process. And then that gets into kind of complicated consequentialist considerations. But I think for oysters, I think it's a relatively sound moral case for eating them in a direct consequentialist perspective.
Okay, interesting. Oh, it's been brought up before that, like, even agriculture harms sentient life as well, like other than plants, obviously. Field mice, hamsters, or whatever that live underneath the ground to get ploughed, right? And insects as well. But, what do you think about those arguments that people bring up? You can't distance yourself from any form of suffering involved in food production unless it's completely in vitro and sort of shut off from like an environment that where more than one creature inhabits, like where sentient and vegetable matter inhabits.
Yeah, it's challenging, and this is one of these things. Like a lot of people will use the term cruelty-free, and a lot of us in the animal rights community don't really like that term because it ignores, things like rodents or insects being
Second order
harmed through like grain agriculture in particular. But I think it's a good consideration. As far as I know, from a direct consequentialist perspective, it still ends up that farmed animal agriculture is like way worse. So one of the obvious things here is that farmed animals eat a lot of grains, and they eat a lot of the same sorts of things that we eat, which means that even if you were to consider about like let's say you actually do buy the argument that like plant suffering matters, which people bring up as a joke, but if you even were to buy that, you would still say that eating animals causes more plants to be harmed. And I think similar things apply directly to grain agriculture and stuff, but I'm not really an expert there. And I would say that in terms of like signaling and stuff, it's a challenge because you don't want to. It's like the oyster thing. You don't want to be seen as inconsistent or give people an excuse to then say like, oh well, you eat grains which still harm animals. Well, I eat eggs, because no animal is directly killed. So even though in some sense they are, that brings about its own issues. So I think that that's another thing that bringing it up in the right circles makes sense. I think in terms of like what you should do on a personal level, if you want to, I think being mindful of those differences and preferring foods that cause less suffering to animals like that would be great. I'd like to see more research in that area in terms of what are the better plant-based foods for that. I am excited for the day when we can have indoor plant agriculture, cultured meat, stuff like that, if it comes along, partially because of those issues. But yeah, I think it's an important consideration.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, I mean, I think it's worth bringing up in vitro meat or in vitro protein, as it is a topical thing. I mean, Bill Gates seems to have like invested quite a lot of money into the R&D around this, and like I've just seen news articles saying that well, the costs of doing such has dropped dramatically, and if the trend continues, it may be viable in the future. In a sense, but we still have power costs and environmental effects from delivering power to these. These are like in vitro factories, in vitro meat or in vitro protein factories. But what do you think about that? You think that it's a good on the whole? You think it's a good idea?
Yeah. So I think cellular agriculture, its existence or its development on net is a very good thing. I think there's a good chance that it's going to play an absolutely instrumental role in the end of animal agriculture. I think whenever it comes to like, should I allocate my personal donations or resources towards that, it becomes more complicated. So we actually have a blog post today coming out soon on this, on the room for more funding. So basically one of the issues that we discussed there is that it seems like a lot of people want cultured meat to be developed, even people who wouldn't otherwise like fund advocacy and stuff like that. Like the pool of people includes investors like Bill Gates and stuff. It also includes like a lot of environmentalist folks and things like that. So it's not clear how much marginal value you can have by spending your resources on that. But in terms of like how important it is in total, I think it's like very important, and I think it's a very good thing. Some animal rights people will have concerns about like, oh well, doesn't cultured meat still require like taking a biopsy of a live animal, creating some cells that you can then grow into a culture? And besides the fact that we could raise a much smaller amount of animals. I mean, I guess that's the main point, is just it would be a huge reduction still. But there's also the consideration that like given other technological progress, there's a good chance that we might be able to just freeze cells, or I mean, I don't think this is really a serious proposition, at least on a large scale, but we could even take them from humans, the cells, or from companion animals or something like that. And it doesn't have to necessarily harm the animal. So yeah, I think it's a good thing. I'm really excited.
Excellent. So in relation to speciesisms and other isms like racism and sexism, so the animal rights movement, what kinds of things can the animal rights movement import from other rights movements? And what has been successful so far? You might want to discuss what areas haven't yet been completely imported that could be imported from other rights movements.
Yeah. So that's a bit challenging to think about what have we imported that's done well, largely because my view right now is that the farmed animal advocacy movement in particular has done a pretty poor job of looking at other social movements. I think we've done a good job of when possible, employing things like randomized control trials, testing two versions of a leaflet, for example, and seeing which one causes people to answer better on a question about how much are you going to reduce your consumption of animal products. I think we've been more challenged in our ability to learn from other social movements. I think some of the things we could learn are, for example, I'm a big proponent of framing farmed animal advocacy as opposing animal agriculture instead of changing your individual consumption. I think that the latter places the burden, places the blame, the guilt on the consumer, the audience that you're usually trying to reach, which I think produces a lot of defensiveness. And I think there's not really any historical precedent for having a consumer-based movement. So boycotts have been utilized in other movements. There was a big sugar boycott in the anti-slavery movement that was pretty successful, but that's largely because I think it built social identity. For a particular example, wasn't a huge cost on people, wasn't a huge social cost, things like that. But I think the approach of the animal advocacy movement right now, the farmed animal advocacy movement, in terms of focusing on go vegan, go vegetarian, has been probably a poor strategic decision, largely because it just hasn't been following the route of other social movements. And I think the alternative to that, focusing on the institution and focusing on the animals, has huge historical precedents. Other rights movements have framed it as a moral imperative that we get rid of this, a horrible institution like segregation, things like that. So, one of the quotes, I don't know the exact quote, but from Brown versus Board of Education in terms of ending segregation was basically that, segregation is inherently cruel. There were people who tried to say like, oh, well, you can still have segregation, with different humans in different places, drinking from different water fountains, but they can be drinking from different water fountains that are just as good. And then where's the issue? Which obviously we very much disagree with now. And in part that was because people recognized that anytime you were separating people based on that, it was going to inherently cause issues because one group was going to have the worst water fountain than the other. And I think that's true in animal advocacy as well. Whenever we're thinking about whether we should oppose animal agriculture in its entirety, or we should focus our rhetoric on, particular cruel practices, because I think that like both, it's a lot of nuance to tell somebody like, well, some animal agriculture is bad, because immediately whenever you say that, people are going to say, oh, well, mine isn't. I only buy from humane farms and stuff. When if you actually ask them about that, they'll say something along the lines of, oh, well, yeah, on Saturdays I go to the farmer's market, and that farmer, he seems like a really nice guy, and he seems like he takes care of his animals. But during the rest of the week, I go out to eat and don't really check and things like that. It provides this really dangerous psychological refuge to people. And I think in that same way, we can learn from those movements and take a more, unilateral standpoint of saying, well, actually, it seems really, 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 really difficult to even physically have an institution of animal agriculture that doesn't involve horrific amounts of suffering. And definitely, like from a practical standpoint, it would take such huge amounts of regulatory resources that I can't see any human civilization ever being willing to expend to ensure that animals had, really good lives and didn't suffer in these really bad ways. That I think it's just so impractical that we should just take a, rights-based, animals shouldn't be farmed, they shouldn't be used for food standpoint. And I think that's something that we learn from partially based on other movements and, what people have done advocating for the rights of other oppressed groups.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So, okay, so what are your thoughts on some of the experimental interventions to reduce animal suffering? We've already discussed the non-human rights project and in vitro meat. Do you think is there any other areas of like some speculative ways that we can reduce suffering in the future that you'd like to touch on?
Yeah, I think legal advocacy and the development of food alternatives both seem really important. I could get into more nuance in either of those. So, for example, I think something that's neglected right now in cultured meat is consumer research and looking at it from the social perspective. Most of the groups are just saying, well, how do we develop this technology? But not many groups are saying, how do we ensure that the public will adopt it? because it's a lot of people might be grossed out by it. They might think it's unnatural or weird. Once it gets popular, it's probably going to get a lot of resistance from the animal agriculture lobby, which is an extremely powerful political institution. And looking at how we can overcome those challenges, I think seems really important and neglected. But in terms of things beyond cultured meat and legal advocacy, I guess the main one is wild animal suffering. And I think animal ethics is doing a great job of this. For example, publishing articles in academia, that could create strength for the idea in some circles that might be more amenable to it, because academics are used to weird ideas and probably more okay with it than the general public. And then eventually either grow that to be a public idea, or have it be in the circles that really matter for decision making. But yeah, offhand, those are sort of the three main ways of helping animals. I guess another one that you might define as experimental is direct action and confrontational activism. It's something that a lot of I think the very nice people that we're friends with would dismiss as like, oh well, that really turns me off. Like, I'm really uncomfortable with that. I don't want somebody, for example, yelling, in a restaurant that I'm in about how animal agriculture is wrong. But I think given historical precedent for things like sit-ins and other confrontational activism working, we should be sympathetic to it and give it serious consideration. On net, I don't think I'm as excited about confrontation as I am about things like legal advocacy and stuff. But I definitely think it has its place, and in some situations it can be really exciting. And I think that it is kind of experimental. And even within the animal rights movement, a lot of people are very dismissive of it, which I think is an error.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, people have brought up that some of the abolitionist movement advocates were quite cantankerous, and a bit scathing, and it would really get on people's nerves at times. So, but maybe there is some validity to what you just said there. I think it's definitely worth investigating for sure. I don't know if I'd be the one, holding up signs outside of a restaurant and trying to make people feel guilty, but it probably does work, right?
Yeah. Well, same for me.
So what about let's tackle another meta question. It's about like trying to evaluate the difference between like the moral value of human suffering and animal suffering, and different forms of animal suffering. We've touched on it in the past, but how do you equate the differences between these? What's the relative moral value of a human compared to a bonobo, compared to a zebra, and then compared to some zooplankton, or a mussel or whatnot?
I think I don't have great answers to this question either. One thing worth noting is that at ACE we've thought about this internally, mainly because lots of people are interested in this question because it seems like a really important one, but it also seems really difficult, at least to make in some way that lots of people will agree with it. It just involves so many subjective judgment calls. Like me, for example, I place a lot of value just on systems that are complex and show learning, and show that they want to reach certain goals and things like that. And I think that's kind of a simple behavioral description of what I care about in terms of what makes something conscious, or what makes something morally valuable. Whereas I think other people might be really skeptical of the ability for things that don't have mammalian neocortices to experience what they would call like suffering and things like that. And people have those sorts of different criteria. I think for me, I take a pretty general standpoint. I don't know if I'm quite as general as someone like Brian Tomasic, although I'm definitely I think he's much closer to being right in terms of thinking that in aggregate, at least insects and zooplankton are very morally valuable. But I think that they're important. I think that within the realm of like humans, other primates, other mammals, and then birds, and even fish I would include as well. So I mean, I would include amphibians and reptiles, although they don't come up as much. I think within that, I'm pretty. So I guess that's vertebrates, and then I would include things like octopi in there as well. I think I see all of those as like of comparable moral importance. I don't have quantitative trade-off numbers on hand, and I don't really think that way. I kind of think more qualitatively about it, but I definitely put those all in like the top tier of, you know, individuals who are definitely worthy of intense moral consideration. And then, you know, whenever it comes to insects and beings like that, you know, I think the case to be made for them is largely an aggregate. You know, even if I don't value every individual as much, given the huge number of insects and creatures like that, they seem very important.
Well, do you mind if we start focusing on some of the wider wild animal suffering? I mean, we already had done a little bit, like for instance, yeah. So let's talk an overview of wild animal suffering in such that it doesn't really happen in farms. We've already sort of spoken about, but is it okay because it happens in the wild? People have sort of highlighted a naturalistic fallacy, which you did before, but generally, what do you think? And should we be, you know, doing something about wild animal suffering?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned the point I did earlier, which is that like the intensity of suffering and the desperation of an individual to stop intense suffering seems to trump through most moral views any concern for just naturalness or any concern for, you know, the ecosystem as a whole or harmony or something like that, or those concerns about imposing morality. So I think the appeal to nature definitely fails. Yeah, yeah.
So, what can we do to further understand what constitutes as wild animal suffering moving forward into the future? What sort of research activities do you think will be the most promising?
Yeah, so I think there are two main research activities. One is, you know, looking at interventions, and then the other is better understanding what the wild looks like in terms of suffering. So if you look at it from an individual animal standpoint, you know, one of the important questions here is, of course, you know, is it net positive or net negative? You know, a lot of people in our circles, I think of it as net negative. I basically claim mighty and uncertainty here. I think I'm relatively agnostic. I think that, at least personally, I want to focus my resources on better equipping us to make that decision in the future, rather than on increasing or decreasing the size of the wild. So, you know, I think I side with people like Brian Tomasic in saying that, you know, we shouldn't be rewilding right now. We shouldn't be spreading more wild to other planets. But, you know, I think we should be very cautious before, you know, reducing the size of the wild. You know, especially in large swaths, and that sort of thing. But I think that for interventions, the challenge is that most of the things that we might be able to make a lot of progress on now and do things like small trials and stuff seem to be things that don't actually have a huge consequence compared to the entire size of the wild. Which are things like vaccines and contraceptions and stuff, which, you know, don't seem like they're going to solve the issue by any means, and they might introduce a lot of complications that might be net harmful. But I think doing some research into those would be helpful and would inform the other ones. Also, those are topics that are, you know, the public is more amenable to right now, which might make them more promising, at least as a, you know, a gateway into the larger interventions that people are considering. You know, like David Pierce talking about CRISPR, you know, gene editing technology to reduce suffering in wild animals, you know, by reducing their sensitivity to pain. But I think I'm not an expert on that, but I think it would still enable them to, you know, make the sorts of decisions that they need to make to survive in the wild. They just wouldn't have the phenomenal nature of it, you know, the suffering, the badness of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it seems as though in some of the responses to your article, there's been a bit of like a rhetoric and been thrown about, and you've been labelled as being narcissistic and full of hubris and things like that. But in terms of taking the debate forward and moving, you know, I guess progressing the dialogue, is it useful to sort of, because you also mentioned like you know, riling up the public and confrontational tactics in advocating reducing reducing animal suffering in general. What place does rhetoric have then in progressing the dialogue forward? And in what ways is it useful? In what ways could it be harmful?
Yeah, so I'm definitely less optimistic about confrontation when it comes to wild animal suffering than I am about farmed animal suffering. I think confrontation becomes more useful when more people agree with you. So I think confrontation can be really useful if it's a situation where like lots of people agree with you but are afraid to speak out, or lots of people agree with you but there's social pressure keeping them from doing so. I think it can really, take people from being just passersby and turn them into activists and things like that. I think with wild animal suffering, because of how strong people's intuitions are against it, many people, confrontation isn't as promising. For example, this was, as you mentioned, I got some negative feedback on the Vox article. Got lots of positive feedback too. Should be worth
Yes,
noting.
that's true. Yeah, it should be. Yes. Sorry, I
but
didn't.
among yeah. But it's a challenge thinking about how to respond to that negative feedback. I think one of the good things about responding to feedback and engaging with those things like claims of narcissism on wild animals is I think like most people would agree upon reflection that it's not narcissistic once you say things like, well, if you were in that position, what would you think? Would you want somebody to help you, or would you want somebody to not help you because you didn't want them to be a narcissist? Or things like human natural suffering, things like smallpox and stuff like that. Like, do you want us to not do those because you feel like it's messing with nature or something like that? So I think whenever you have an opportunity to engage someone in deep conversation and get them to actually engage with those arguments, I think it's a good idea. If you're on Twitter and you have 140 characters, I think it's a lot harder to get somebody to engage fully with those. So I might be more skeptical. But in terms of how we eventually move forward past those defenses, I think a large part of it is just establishing ourselves and establishing wild animal suffering as a view, like or helping wild animals as a view that has lots of proponents and lots of support, and it has people seriously thinking about it, not just a few crackpots and people who are embedded in other communities. So for example, people in the animal rights community or people in the environmentalism community. So there's a line of environmentalism, I think it's called compassionate conservation, which is advocating for, instead of culling animals by, hunting them, instead doing it through things like contraception and stuff. And I think although, when push comes to shove, they might disagree with some wild animal advocates on things, I think they could be a really helpful ally. And I think as we show that more people are taking this view seriously, people will respect it more and won't dismiss it so easily. And then we can get them in those thoughtful conversations where we, can really present our arguments in more than 140 characters. And I'd be really excited about doing that.
Fantastic. And now Brian Tomasic did actually offer up some questions,
Yeah,
as you know, on Facebook. So I think a couple of them that haven't been sort of addressed properly yet is, what's your probability that aggregate wild animal experiences are positive on balance? So, okay, balance up. How much suffering compared to how much happiness or positive flourishing they experience in the wild?
Yeah, so I think this is a challenging question. And like I said, I think I sort of just claim agnosticism, at least when it comes to practice, meaning that I'm not going to like take actions that heavily depend on the answer to this question. I think I do find Brian's arguments that suffering outweighs happiness pretty compelling. I do have some concerns. So for example, I think whenever it comes to insects, I think that if I were to live the life of an insect, living just a few days and then dying of starvation, for example, I would think that was a really miserable life and I would not want to live that. I definitely think that's net negative. But whenever it comes to insects who have evolved very differently than us, it's one of these things where like if all insects were living their lives being absolutely miserable, I don't see them as doing very well. I think there's a good case to be made for not seeing them as doing very well, in terms of evolutionary advantage and their ability to survive and reproduce and things. This is like humans. Whenever humans become depressed, I think if we were depressed all the time, we would have do a very poor job at things like hunting or things like foraging that we needed to do in order to survive, and reproduce. So I see arguments on both sides. I guess I would maybe assign more weight to it being net negative, but I don't think I'm prepared to take actions that heavily depend on that outcome.
Fair enough. Okay, so what's your thoughts on the sign of expected value of the far future? For instance, one particular project, if you did care about the far future, would be AI safety. If you think that that's a project worth mentioning or following, sorry. So what do you think about the far future? and lives in the far future? How much value do you put on those?
Yeah. So in terms of how much value I put on lives in the far future, I consider myself a total hedonistic utilitarian in the sense that I have no bias across species, across time period, across anything, across location would be the most common third one. So I definitely see far future lives as valuable. And I buy the argument that there's like a decent chance, a non infinitesimal chance of us, colonizing a very large area of space, in which case, the bulk of moral value likely lies in the far future, at least in expectation. Um, in terms of the sign of it, this is actually, we've touched on the two judgment calls where I claim 90 and uncertainty, and I'm basically agnostic. I think on the far future, I see good arguments for it being positive. I see good arguments for it being negative. I think I see a stronger case that the sentient individuals who are in charge of the universe, or maybe not sentient, but the intelligent at least individuals who are in charge of the universe in the far future are more likely to optimize it for happiness than for suffering. I think it'd be a really weird universe if they optimize it for suffering, but I see like a chance that they could want to create actual utopia in some sense. So in that sense, I think I might weigh in the positive direction, but then I also think that I assign a very large likelihood to there being an upper class of sentient beings, like there are humans today, who sort of use and don't give proper consideration to the lower class of sentient beings. And I think there's a good chance that will involve making their lives not very pleasant. In which case, I see a good chance for a negative value. But then, if you're thinking about, well, even if there's a higher likelihood than that, than the optimizing for the positive, if you're optimizing for the positive because of how much sheer value you create, that might outweigh it. So, I mean, if I had to pick one or the other, I might weigh positive. But when it comes to practical decisions, again, I don't like to make judgments that rely on this outcome, which is one of the reasons why I think, moral X risk and the existential risk of having a really bad dystopian society is a more important thing to work on in most cases than X risk of the extinction sort.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep. So have you read much science fiction before? Are you aware of David Brin's work on animal uplifting and things like that?
No, not David Brin.
Okay, yeah. You might be interesting to you. He wrote a whole series on uplifting animals, and if you're into sci-fi, that would be an obvious thing to look. Cool. Yes, that's right, David Brin with one N. Another last question then is, how do you trade off short-term helping versus far future impact, and how much to discount the far future for reasons of uncertainty and anthropics?
Yeah, so this is a good question because it ties into why I'm so excited about animal advocacy. I think one of the compelling things about creating social change to create a society that better respects animals is that it's robust through a lot of different considerations. So I think whether you value the far future or whether you value the present, social change for animals is really important. And actually, this is one of the reasons why I got excited about animal advocacy in the first place, was because I was thinking about the far future and thinking about the present. I don't think I'd ever be in the situation where I would assign like over 99% of my like moral value in terms of decision making, not in terms of just sheer expected value, to either of those cases. I think right now I'm about at 70-30. So 70% of my decision making comes from long-term effects and 30% comes from near-term effects. And I think in both of those cases, animal advocacy does really well. And honestly, like that's basically why I'm working on it. There are other situations. So like, if you want to think about, do I want to work on things that are very high in scale versus very high in tractability and very high in neglectedness? Animal advocacy is one of the few causes that does very well in all three of them. Like I said, I think tractability might be the weakest one, but I think overall it still does very well. I think if you're thinking about really robust causes with a lot of evidence compared to very speculative causes, I think animal advocacy does pretty well in both of those terms. It's certainly less robust than something like Against Malaria Foundation distributing anti-malarial nets, but it's certainly less speculative than, AI safety, for example. So yeah, I think I account for both in my moral decision-making, the far future and near-term considerations. And I think that the fact that animal advocacy does so well on both is a very good reason for, if you're like me and, kind of take a hedgehog or a cluster thinking approach to decision-making, makes the case for animal advocacy even more compelling.
Excellent. Well, it's been a very fantastic interview, and look, I'm so glad you responded to my interview request, especially in light of the the Vox article we've just written, which has gotten a lot of attention. And I'll also put the links to the Vox article and some of the responses in the description here. But lastly, is there any particular points that you'd like to actually end on that I haven't brought up, or it's a conclusive sort of overview that you'd like to bring up to end the interview?
Yeah. So you asked really good questions, and I think I touched on all the important things. The things that I would have said if you hadn't asked me the right questions would have been things like how I think lots of people in effective altruism and rational circles, the thing that they need to do in order to fully appreciate the importance of animal advocacy is actually not any specific rational argument. It's overcoming the bias of speciesism. So, for me, this consisted of literally just sitting down and saying, okay, I have these criteria, like here are 10 different considerations, how robust is the evidence, what scale is the cause, and things like that. And looking at that and then comparing it to something for a human cause and saying, okay, like animal advocacy clearly wins. Why am I not working on animal advocacy? And that was really important to me. So I think a lot of people could be affected by that. And overcoming speciesism and getting to know the personhood of animals in that sense. And I think this is important even if you're not going to focus on animal advocacy as a cause area. One of the biggest things you can do for social change is sort of have your feet wet in two ponds, and then bridge the gap between those. So personally, I like to do this between effective altruism and animal rights. I like to try and make effective altruists more anti-speciesist, but I also like to take all the very passionate animal rights activists and help them think about effectiveness and how they can do what they're doing even better. So I think being animal friendly, even if most of your work is on AI, for example, is really important. Because whenever we program the AIs, it's fortunate that people like Nick Bostrom, have taken really positive views and talked about all sentient creatures mattering, and those sorts of things. Because if the decision makers, whenever AI comes along, if that ends up being very important, I'd really like those decision makers to be fully accounting for the moral value of non-human animals and their considerations. So yeah, but no, really great questions. I feel like we touched on basically like all of the things that really matter to me in terms of my work, and then also my own thinking about cost prioritization and things. Yeah, and I'll continue writing. I write for Huffington Post mostly. I'll probably have a piece coming out soon in the Dodo, which is an animal publication. Also might write more for Vox in the future and things like that. But would definitely love for people to follow and give me feedback and things like that.
Fantastic, Jacy. It's been wonderful having you here on the show, being interviewed. And yeah, look, I'm looking forward to seeing more of your articles and hearing more about what you do in the future. So yeah, it's been wonderful.
Awesome. Take care, Adam. Have a good day.
Cheers, mate. Bye.